Hello, I'm Mark Uncapher, and welcome to the Republican Toolbox. What do party central committee members do? Just a word, this is a Maryland-centric approach to central committee members. Frankly, the way parties are organized are different from state to state. So while some of the legal specifics are unique to Maryland, I do think there's some general commonality. I'm joined with Liliana Norkaitis, and we'll talk about why she's so special and so unique when we get to this next slide, which is how are Central Committee members chosen? And we'll talk about, first of all, they're elected in by Republican primary votes. And again, in Maryland, it's in the year that the governor and state legislature is elected. That comes the 2 years after the presidential year. The way that's done, let me go back. The way that's done is the constituency depends by county. So in some counties, everybody is elected at large. In some counties, they're distributed at large and by state legislative district, and in some cases, in Baltimore County in particular, by county council district or some combination. All you do in order to file, again, is to go to the County Board of Elections and fill out a form and set up a committee. And in some cases, you can win by default because you have no opponent. In other cases, you do have a contested primary, and then you take office after the general election. Now, let me go back to you, Liliana, because you have uh, the unique background of having been the youngest, and I think you're still the youngest Central Committee member. Can you explain a little bit about how you got on the Central Committee?
Yes. So when I was 17 and 10 months old, I applied for a vacancy on the Republican Central Committee of Harford County. So, per Maryland law, you can become a registered voter at the age of 16. You don't become an eligible voter until you are 18. But the bylaws for the Maryland Republican Party simply say that you have to be a registered voter in the state of Maryland. So, with that, I went forth, went through the application process. There were other candidates as well, and I was selected by the committee to fill that vacancy. So I served in the first term from it was about December 2021 up until the general election, which was the vacancy. That was the term of the vacancy that I had filled. And yeah, and then I applied again a little bit later, this March of this year, and
We
got
should
back.
probably we should probably go back a little bit. You were a candidate for election in the 2022 primary.
Yes, so I
Um,
did run in the 2022 primary, was unfortunately unsuccessful, but I can talk a little bit more about that.
you probably should talk about how many candidates were running because that's also
Yes, so
probably
Harford County is at large. So all 12 seats are anyone can vie for those seats no matter where you live in the county. So there were, I believe, 16 candidates for 12 spots. And I unfortunately came up 13th, so I was just below the threshold that was needed to secure a full seat for the 4-year term. But learned a lot. My name got out there, and so I'll try again soon. But yes, so with Harford County, with it being as large of a ballot, it is sometimes a little bit more difficult to get voters to select 12 boxes, or at least have one of your names be one of those 12.
so another county with a different experience because you were a student at or still are a student, but at the time you were a student in College Park at University of Maryland. You filled a brief vacancy after in 2023 or 2022. I'm trying to
I did in
remember.
2022.
On
It was yes, right after the general. I had briefly filled a vacancy on the Prince George's County Central Committee, and that was separated by legislative district. So I had represented the legislative district for College Park, and that committee is a little bit different. So I believe it's a 16-member committee. And originally, only 2 people were on the ballot for that for 2022. So those 2 immediately got on, and then the rest were later appointed.
So let me go back to the prior slide. So let's talk about what committees do. And I think we've already referenced the fact that's kind of important, which is members take office after the general election. So there's this interim period when people know what the outcome of the election is. And that said, some are off and some are on. I know you in particular worked very hard, even though you knew you were going to be going off after the election. And obviously that was reflected in the fact that you were welcomed back on the board. Now, one of the things that does happen is after the election, there is this county party meeting, these organization meetings. Can you describe a little bit about how that works, even though you weren't precisely part of it? I think maybe unless you were in Prince George's County.
Yeah, so the organizational meeting is essentially the first meeting of the term, where you elect your chairman, your vice chairman, your secretary, your treasurer, and then kind of set forth the day that you're going to meet, the location, things like that, so that the body is all on the same page for the 4-year term.
So we'll talk about that after the county election or the county organization meeting that takes place after the election is the state party convention. In Maryland, we have 2 conventions a year, typically in late November, early December, and then May to June that take place, and where basically state party business takes place. It rotates around the state, different locations. So that is a responsibility that members of the Central Committee have for their counties, and they represent their counties as part of their delegation. We'll talk a little bit more details, but in a general way, there's really building and maintaining the Republican infrastructure, and that comes in a variety of ways. I would probably underscore this next one, which is recruitment. We members of the Central Committee have a responsibility for recruitment, and that can take place in a number of different ways. And we'll talk a little bit about auxiliary groups because that is one of the sort of major ways that people get involved in the party. One of your other hats, Liliana, is you're chairman of the College Republicans, and that is one of the auxiliary groups that's very active within the party. And then another one is the Women's Federation, and you are an officer of that as well. So we'll take that, and we'll also talk about supporting candidates. So now we'll move on to the next slide. It's probably this is one to spend a little bit of time, because a lot of times when people come on central committees for the first time, they're not as familiar with the things that the party doesn't do. So, for example, the party does not have a platform. The National Party has a platform, but typically local parties don't take positions on policy positions. They typically follow the lead of our elected officials. And in Maryland, our county parties do not endorse candidates. Now, there's a bit of a tightrope that exists there, which is that individuals as volunteers who are members of the Central Committee can take very active roles in committees, in candidates and support. But formally, there is not an endorsement process. And typically, they do not fund political campaigns. Now, sometimes you'll see funds that flow through the party campaign committees, but that really is typically a function of the money that is raised by the candidates that, for a variety of legal reasons, throw through the process. There is separate from the central committees caucuses. That is, the state legislature have committees that provide some financial support for legislative candidates. So that's a bit of an exception to that issue of not providing political financial support, but that's typically not the case at the county level. Next slide. So this is kind of a good example. I worked in a very, very blue area. I was Montgomery County chairman, and I can tell you in my experience that Republicans are very eager to hear from you. And there's a lot of enthusiasm when people have. Liliana, you've had experience both in Prince George's, so it was more as a student, but you can really talk to what it's like to be in Harford County, which is in a redder area.
Yeah, so definitely total opposites when you are talking with voters of or Republican voters of a blue area versus a red area. In those blue areas, you are right, Mark, that Republicans are eager to meet fellow Republicans because they are so few and far between. And I can speak even on campus. Republicans usually are not as outspoken, and again, just definitely feel a lot more comfort in finding like-minded individuals. In red areas, there are so many Republicans that you usually can just turn around and there's another one. So you will see a lot more Trump signs and American flags and things like that, where people are a lot more open to sharing their views and being active within the community because they believe in the elected officials that they voted in. So
And in purple areas, you'll have plenty of campaigns to keep you busy because those are really the battleground areas. I mean, one comment I would make about red areas is you do also have a lot more. You have, by definition, a lot of elected officials that you work with. So you'll have
yes.
part of being a committee member in those areas is really working more directly with the host of elected officials you have and both their campaigns and their support and their events and everything else.
Well, and then
Next.
recruitment in those areas, in those red areas, is not nearly as difficult as it is in those blue areas, where finding someone to run for county executive of Hartford County is going to be a lot easier than finding someone to run in Prince George's County, simply just because of the nature of that pipeline of candidates that already exists.
Next slide. So we've talked about recruitment, and this is really a big part of the job that goes into being part of a central committee. Um, and first of all, it's kind of worth thinking about who are the people who are the most likely to volunteer. And I think there's a couple of categories, there are characteristics, I should say, that are kind of recurring. The people who are the most likely to get involved are paradoxically people who are already pretty involved in a variety of activities in community and civic and church activities. One of the things, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but you look for are people who routinely vote in Republican primaries, who make it a point to go vote in every election and are committed. And that's probably one of the best indicators of interest. But then thirdly, it's somebody who was asked to be involved, and people don't necessarily sign up themselves, but when somebody else that they know and like asks them to get involved, that can make a big difference. For anyone running either a campaign or a club or any kind of activity, first impressions really matter. The reaction that you get, or whether or not you feel comfortable when you want to be involved, makes a big difference. And it's easy to kind of overlook how awkward that person who comes in for the first time can feel. Do they feel at home or do they feel greeted? Um, One of the other pieces for volunteer recruitment is obviously you try to make them feel comfortable, but to make sure that you have some kind of follow up. Uh, Typically, the most dangerous time or the most vulnerable time for volunteer recruitment is after somebody's made their first contact and come, and whether or not somebody reached out to them and made them feel welcome and comfortable and come back in. And I like to think of this as kind of a shot clock of did somebody get back in touch in an appropriate time with a way of getting them involved and getting them engaged. Um, and sometimes, finally, I make a point about looking for what I call the soft ask. That may be something that's not necessarily really onerous, it's not really difficult, but it may be something that kind of tests the water as to whether or not somebody wants to get more involved. It could be as simple as putting up a lawn sign or coming to a big event or something else that provides kind of an easy way for somebody to can show their continued engagement. Next slide. So I may turn back to Liliana on this, but understanding voter data, you've seen a lot of. I guess we can set it up by saying that Republicans have a lot of information from voter lists that we share with campaigns and with central committees. And so, Liliana, tell me about how all of this works.
Yeah, so just looking at the first bullet point, voters are ranked. It's 1 through 4 for how many times they have voted in the last 4 cycles. So I myself am a now 2-2 voter that I voted in 2 primaries and 2 generals. But because I'm 20, those literally are the only elections I could have voted in. So I haven't per se missed any, but I have only voted in 2 of them. So you will also have your newly registered voters, your voters who might have just registered for the first time at the DMV or have moved into the state or the county. So these are always important to reach out to, just because it is definitely a possibility to get them into, or at least interested in the politics in the area, and become an active Republican. So when looking at data, it is important to look at the age of the person, see which elections they vote in. If they only vote in the generals or only vote in the midterms, or don't vote in the primaries, or only voting in the presidential, that there is a lot to unpack with voter data, and it is definitely important to kind of to look at all of the data between the generals and the primaries and the presidentials and the gubernatorials, because it is going to be much different turnout wise for any of those elections.
And as we say, we have a limited amount of time and resources, and so prioritizing who we reach makes a big difference. And perhaps the touch that is the most likely to result in perhaps what we call low propensity voter can make a lot of sense. That said, as I referenced for volunteers, the 4 4s are people who voted in the last general 4 times in the last 4 primaries, and they're the most likely to be committed. So they're the most likely to be receptive to being a volunteer or putting up a lawn sign or being involved in some other kind of way. Next slide. So what can you do? This is kind of a laundry list of different ways in which we kind of talked before about giving people the soft ask. These are a variety of jobs. Um, I'm trying to think, how many of these have you performed over the years, Liliana?
Oh
Probably
man,
if you,
I have definitely done phone calls. I've definitely done canvassing and lit drops. I can't say I've driven people to the polls, but I definitely know people who have done that. You also sometimes have like some sort of election day hotline, so someone who's sitting at the phone during the time in which the polls are open, just to see if there's any situation or anything that might need to be remedied at a polling place. So that I've definitely done. I know Mark has done that. So yes, there are an ample number of positions that volunteers can do to
so
prepare.
you've seen two here. Obviously, welcoming chairman is a great way to meet people who've moved into the area. But I think the last bullet is probably one that you're familiar with, which is you referenced at the outset high school voter registration. The fact that in Maryland, you don't have to be 18 to register to vote. You only have to be 18 by the time of the first election that you could participate in. And so there's an opportunity to register voters between the ages of 16 and 18. Next slide. So I've put this has actually the busiest slide of all, and this is kind of hard to read. And I'm not going to try and read it, but I've kind of thrown this as an opportunity, kind of like, how do you're at the doorstop talking to somebody. How would you talk to somebody? What are the things that you might talk about? Chances are you will never go through this entire list, and so you probably are going to cut and paste and talk about, well, maybe it's a lawn sign issue or a precinct chair issue or becoming a volunteer or something else. But this is kind of an example of how you might start a conversation. One, introduce yourself as a neighbor. You always want to have that, if you have a connection, to be able to reference that personal connection, that affinity that you might have. You want to explain why you are reaching out to them. In this case, I referenced the fact that you're a regular Republican voter and you appreciate that. That would be obviously a way to talk to somebody who is a 4-4. We referenced the soft ask of a lawn sign, which is kind of, you're willing to take your partisan affiliation up to a next level. Many parties have email lists or newsletter lists, and that's a way of keeping in touch with people, and having an email address is really handy in the process. And then the next kind of set is a potential list of a couple of asks. I will tell you just from experience that the number of people who feel comfortable raising money or asking for a donation is small. Some people feel uncomfortable about that. There's plenty to do other than that. And frankly, if you do all of this for enough, you probably will end up feeling comfortable at some point as well doing that. The next slide. And this is yet another way of organizing this kind of laundry list of jobs that we have. Precinct chairs are very much kind of a building block for the party. So wherever you are, whether you're a central committee member in a legislative district or county council or in a county, one of the areas you're going to want to be doing is organizing a local structure. Um, so many of the jobs are broken down. I've broken down what the skills are and also the time commitment. Again, this is going to be a question that many people, when they're asked to be a volunteer, are going to want to know, well, how much, what's it going to take, or how long, what do I need to commit to? And this is a kind of a way of taking people through that process. Again, lots to do there, but this kind of makes it, I think, more digestible. Next slide. Here's a good thing to talk. If it's not clear, volunteers are a major theme of this set of requirements that central committees have. They are volunteers, so you may be used to working in a business where somebody's getting a paycheck. Frankly, they're volunteers. They're only there because they want to help out, and you need to treat them as such. You really need to treat them as gold. You may kind of look for the strengths of various people. I referenced that some people feel comfortable, would be very comfortable raising money other people want. You're going to feel them out as to what they would like to be willing to do. There are lots of people who like to go face to face and engage with people where somebody else wants to be behind the scenes. And if you have a sense, there's some who only want to be involved on election day. Um, that said, don't underestimate people. You'd be surprised what, if you ask them to do it, they're willing to do. So, Liliana, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to put you on the spot. Can you think of a job that you were asked to do that when you first were asked to do it, you weren't quite sure you'd be ready to do, but then you ended up doing? That is, I realize that's putting you on the spot there, but it's a good example of how central committee members end up getting sort of more involved than they originally expected.
Yeah, I definitely think I am an unconventional volunteer, and I'm usually happy to do whatever I'm asked to do. But I guess at the start, being young, having somewhat of a background in communications, I'm typically the one who is looked at of, oh, you can run the social media, or oh, you can redo the website. So I rebuilt the entire website for the Republican Central Committee of Harford County, and that was a huge undertaking. Just again, having to go through edits and things like that, and I pretty much did that as soon as I got on in March. So that was definitely a big task, that in the end, happy to have done it. But if I didn't have that established rapport with other members, I don't know if I would have done it. Just because it is a big ask. And so that's where, again, starting it at something where that person has the capabilities of doing it, and then kind of working up to the bigger asks is always crucial.
That's a great example, and that's a great way in which somebody relatively early on, you were fairly young in terms of your involvement, got kind of involved in a major way in the party. Next slide. One of the areas that is important for the party, and I think increasingly becoming, as we look at the success that Republicans had in other states, where states like Florida, that used to have a Democratic registration, have flipped towards Republican. Other states like Pennsylvania have seen a big increase in the number of Republican registration. So this is an area that we put more emphasis on. Um, there's a process. I won't go through all of it. We actually will have a separate video about voter registration, but it's something to be mindful of. It is important to remember, at least in Maryland, that there are very specific rules about what you can and can't do a registration. They actually, speaking Maryland, they have a training process for it and a certification at the Board of Elections. That's a way to get started. New neighbors, great way to introduce yourself if you're working at that level. We've already referenced the registration for people under the age of 18. And it's a great opportunity to talk cross-check for unregistered households in the area. Not mentioned specifically, but one area that is a real priority for registration for Republicans is with those people who are declined estates, that is, they're independents. It's a large number, it's a growing number, and yet we do know from the data that people tend to vote either Republican or Democrats, and there's some ways of being able to tease out which way they come. If we can get them to re-register as Republicans, that's a good thing. That tend to be more loyal voters. So that's an important function. Next slide. Supporting candidates. I know you've done a fair amount of this, Liliana. Door-to-door work. One of my great stories about you, and I'll tell the anecdote for you, is that you got out of school when you were in high school because you were going to appear with the governor. And I think the next day they thought they discovered that you weren't making that up, and you can explain how that happened.
Yeah, so it was a meet and greet, or maybe a press conference, one of the two. And I had stood I gave a note saying, I will be leaving school early to go to a press conference with Governor Hogan. And I think I got some heads of like, yeah, okay. And I had two of my teachers who were watching the 5 o'clock news saw me on WBAL right behind Governor Hogan. And they were like, wow, you were not kidding. And so, yeah, definitely, with the bigger campaigns, when you have, press conferences and things like that, those are definitely fun and all about, energizing the candidate. And those can often be some of the best events.
So television, we're not promising television appearances for everybody on central committees, because there are lots of ways in which central committee members can be active in supporting candidates, but it is something that does come with the territory. And obviously, we've talked about lawn signs and whatever. Door knocking is a very important function. Bear in mind, again, this is going to be a separate video. We don't look to change people's minds, but we're really looking to find common ground, and then maybe focus on either if the Republicans get them to vote early, or at least introduce them to a candidate they're not already familiar with. Next slide. Getting out to vote. This is an important area that we're spending a lot of time focused on mail-in ballots. We call it now Bank the Vote. This is to encourage people to get their vote in early and to apply. And that way, for our Get Out the Vote efforts, we don't have to waste resources or focus resources on voters that we know have already voted, but can then move on to get them to come. I see we reference the absentee ballot application. It is technically mail-in ballot, and I have to say that there's a tendency to use the language that used to be appropriate for absentee ballots, but it is now mail-in ballot, and it now doesn't require any excuse. Another area where we're active as a party, and this is something central committees perform, is having a Republican presence at the polls. That is sort of a table, a booth, and information, particularly about the down ballot candidates, so people can provide information. It's also a great opportunity to recruit people because they're looking they can see a Republican presence at the polls and engage at that time. So that's an important part of what central committees and their committees do. Next slide. So this is my final word. I will tell you, the work of a central committee member is never done, and I like to analogize that it's a lot like gardening. So you kind of prune the hedges and you plant seeds and what have you. But if you don't keep at it on a regular basis, the garden goes to, well, not to pot. That would be something separate. But basically doesn't come the way you want it to do. So the work is never done. There's a lot of activities that need to be done on a recurring basis, or the party is less effective. And I will say that this is kind of a last thing to point out is that in Maryland, both for Republicans, especially in red areas, but also Democrats in blue areas, there is a tendency for Central Committee membership to be a stepping stone for public office. And that many vacancies in both parties are filled from the ranks of Central Committee members, and they end up getting recruited. They also get recruited, not just with vacancies, but they get recruited to run for office themselves, and that's a recurring phenomenon. So it's certainly potentially an incentive for participation in party politics. Next slide. So well, thank you and good luck. But Liliana, I'll put you back on the spot to see if you have any final words of wisdom that you want to share with people about sort of what are the advantages of being involved as a Central Committee member.
Yeah, I think, for anyone who is, wondering whether they've done enough in the community or, whether they're even qualified to be a Central Committee member, I think as long as you have the drive to fundraise and door knock for candidates and get the vote out for candidates, that you are more than qualified. Whether, you think you're too young or too old or, too this or too that, the Central Committee is a great spot to start in that role of, private office and, as Mark said, eventually run for public office if you would like to. So yeah, again, keep at it. Get your friends involved if, you want necessarily some allies or something, on the committee with you. That building a good team is always important. That, some Central Committees will, as Mark and I have seen, might not work as well as others, but part of it is ensuring that if you're a worker bee, the Central Committee needs you. That if you are willing to put in the time and energy that it takes to get candidates elected, run for the Central Committee, because it is crucial not just for the local party, but the state and the national party, that we have these positions at the local levels filled with good people.
Well, thank you very much. And that concludes this presentation.